I've just learned actually in the last few minutes from my grandson Sean that it was Earth Day, and that might have been the putative reason for the pantomime which took place. All it needed was a pantomime horse actually at the front of it in Whitehall this week. Rishi Sunak, who is elected by nobody at all, not even the members of the Conservative Party in Parliament, came over all presidential. They picked the leanest and meanest of London's bobbies to run down the road. It looked more like Dumpling Day than Earth Day to me. And then instead of motorcyclists, we had this parade of cops on push bikes accompanying the gas guzzler that contained Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister. The last time I saw something like that, it was Kim Jong Un, the North Korean leader, who was widely ridiculed for having a gigantic bomb-proof Mercedes, alongside which ran his security detail. And here we are, the British are copying the North Koreans. We were not supposed to laugh at our leader doing it. Only North Korean leaders should be laughed at for such things. If it was for Earth Day, it went over my head or under my feet. I had no idea that that was its purpose, and its purpose was never stated. All it did was make Rishi Sunak look even more small, which is quite an achievement, considering he is pretty much the invisible man in British politics. Invisible, of course, in European politics, in NATO politics, invisible in international politics. It's scarcely worthwhile having him there at all. And there's still talk of Boris Johnson making a comeback. Although Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is now beginning to slip in the polls, so who knows, a second term for Rishi Sunak might not be ruled out. You can't rule out a second term for the incontinent, the feeble, the scarcely cognizant President of the United States of America. I very much hope that the famous deep state in the US has replaced the football at the bottom of his bed, because thinking he's pressing for another cup of cocoa, he might just press the nuclear button and we might all be history, although there'll be no one left to record that history. That this man is in charge of still the most powerful country in the world, whose defense spending dwarfs that of the next 16 countries in total combined. This man, who presides over 800 foreign military bases, many of them bristling with the aforementioned nuclear weapons. This man, who is in charge of a flight of more than 3,500 thermonuclear weapons, cannot tie his shoelaces, cannot make the bathroom in time, even in august company, like His Holiness the Pope in the Vatican. Joe Biden literally soiled himself in front of the head of the Roman Catholic Church. Joe Biden isn't fit to be sent out for a loaf. But not only is he the President of the United States, he's decided he's running again for another term. And the Democratic Party have promptly endorsed him and banned any presidential debates against any candidate who might exercise their democratic right to stand against him. Only one so far has done so, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and when you think about it, it's an act of mercy not to put Joe Biden on a stage with RFK Jr., who, even though he likes him and has known him for all of his life, would knock him out flat. It would not, since Rocky Marciano fought the hapless bunch of horizontal chumps that used to be put up against him, would a mismatch like it have ever been seen. So they've decided not to have any presidential debates. But not only that, Bernie Sanders, on the day that Biden announced he was running again with a record of oppression of workers in the United States, railway workers banned from striking, a record of inflation that is bleeding white the working people of America, a record as long as your arm of imprisoning a whole nation of black people in the United States, a record of being a foghorn for war like the Iraq War throughout his 51 years in the Senate, a record of having dragged us all onto the brink of World War III. Despite all of that, within an hour or two of Biden's announcement, if you can call it that, Bernie Sanders gave him his endorsement. Well, in a way, if the Americans are stupid enough to re-elect Joe Biden, good luck to them. It's their business. But my question to Europe, to Australia, to the rest of the world of vassals over which Joe Biden rules, is why are you following to the edge of a cliff a man more suited to hospice care in a bath chair than the Oval Office in the White House in Washington, D.C.? Why are you taking orders from an emperor so decrepit that he cannot be let out alone, cannot find his way off a stage, cannot read an auto cue, cannot control his own bowels? Have you no self-respect in the chanceries of Europe, in Westminster and Whitehall, down in Canberra? Do you not care about the optics of all of this? You who told us that Donald Trump would put us into World War III are now following blindly this decrepit old man as he drags us closer than we have ever been before, closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, to a world war with nuclear weapons 1,000 times more powerful and deadly than the weapons that we were threatened with back in those days of the early 1960s in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tucker Carlson got the bag. I wonder, we're asking in a poll, what it was that got Fox News' highest rating commentator taken off the air. It couldn't have been the cost of 1.6 million salary a month. I mean, Tucker's good, but he should be good. He has a whole army of people preparing his shows and helping to write his scripts. He reads the scripts from an auto cue, and he gets $1.6 million a month for doing so. He should be good, but he is good, better than all the rest. And it can't be that he was too expensive a ticket, because Rupert Murdoch's son was in the middle of negotiating with him an extension of his contract until 2029. That's how keen Fox were just a week or two ago to keep Tucker Carlson on board, and now they have sacked him. Now, I kind of take the view of Lionel, my good friend in New York, that just like Jon Stewart, remember him, who left primetime American television to go and run a petting zoo in New Jersey or somewhere like it? Jon Stewart was very quickly forgotten. There's a danger, if Tucker Carlson doesn't strike now while the iron is hot, that he will go the same way, forgotten in just the same way. But somehow, I don't think Tucker Carlson is going to go quietly. There's talk today in the financial papers that the Murdochs have trussed him up, gagged him until the end of his contract, which would take him beyond the presidential election. Is Tucker really going to sit out the next presidential election, say nothing about it, only to get his $1.6 million a month? Because if he is, if I was Donald Trump, I'd find some other billionaire to pay him the 1.6 million a month and get him out there on the stump talking and using his name and face recognition in support of a Trump presidency. Maybe that will happen. Maybe Tucker will tell the Murdochs to stick their money for the rest of the contract and make even more money, either on his own, like I'm doing here, or on some other channel, some other platform. We'll have to wait and see. But the big news of the day, bigger than any other news could possibly be, is the announcement from China and from Kiev that President Xi Jinping and President Zelensky had a long telephone conversation last evening, that China has appointed the head of their Eurasian desk in the foreign ministry as a special envoy for China to visit Kiev and to begin a shuttle of diplomacy which is long overdue and which has been precluded by the veto, by the blackballing of exactly that by the United States government in Washington, who you'll recall, the last time there was any possibility of peace brokered by Turkey, they sent Boris Johnson to Kiev to warn Zelensky that he would not be permitted to agree to a ceasefire and a political solution to a conflict which has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, the treasure of both countries, and the wrecked economies of all the sanctioning countries that followed Joe Biden in his bid to lift a huge rock only to drop it on our own feet. Xi Jinping doesn't go in for stunts. He's not a PR type of guy. If he has made this call, he must have known that the call would be received well. If he has appointed this envoy, he must know that the envoy stands at least a fighting chance of being able to broker a peace deal. What would a peace deal look like? Well, I don't speak for Russia. I have no idea of Russia's mind in this affair. I haven't even spoken to a Russian about it. Not any Russian at all, of any kind. Not even Igor, that serves me up my borscht in my local Russian restaurant. I've no idea if this is Russia's point of view. But if I was running Russia, here are the minimum terms for an end to the war that I would accept. First of all, self-determination for the Russian-speaking people of eastern Ukraine. This is a must. Russia has not gone this far, done all this, suffered the ostracism and sanction of the entire so-called Western world in order to hand back its compatriots, its co-religionists, its fellow Russian citizens, now in many cases, to the tender mercy of an ultra-nationalist government in Kiev, tinged with Nazi support. If not at the fringes, then perhaps a little bit in, closer than just the fringes. They will not do that. They will never accept it. The Russian people would never accept it either. The banning not just of Ukraine joining NATO, but of NATO joining Ukraine. All kinds of people have been fixated on the issue of whether or not Ukraine can join NATO, but NATO joined Ukraine, according to Stoltenberg, as long ago as 2014, and many would argue, I among them, that NATO has been in Ukraine almost from the day that the Ukrainian state was formed. So a formula which ensures that Ukraine doesn't join NATO and NATO is nowhere near Ukraine would, it seem to me, be an obvious red line for Moscow in exchange for stopping the advance of the Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. A third would be an explanation for and full transparency over the dozens of biolabs that the United States Department of Defense set up all over Ukraine. If I were the Russians, I would want full transparency over that. And lastly, I would want the lifting of all the sanctions imposed on Russia as a result of the special military operation which began in February of 2022. The sanctions have not affected Russia in the way that they intended, but they've affected the countries that imposed them very severely indeed. And as I'm not a Russian and don't speak for Russia, and I'm a European and a British citizen, I want our countries to escape from that self-inflicted wound that we imposed upon ourselves when we embarked on this road of sanctions. So an end to sanctions, an end to the tango between Kiev and NATO and Kiev, self-determination for the Russian-speaking people of eastern and southern Ukraine, and lastly, a recognition that the Crimean Peninsula, which was a part of Russia for thousands of years, which voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia, will be recognized internationally as a part of Russia. The Russian fleet requires Crimea. They will never give it up. The people of Crimea would never agree to it being given up. Lastly, I pose a simple question. It's a simple question to which there is literally no answer possible. Today, Ursula von der Leyen at the dispatch box made a fulsome celebration, she said, of the 75 years of the existence of the State of Israel. A state which, in defiance of all international law, continues illegally to occupy huge tracts of Palestinian land and has illegally annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and openly threatens to annex the Jordan Valley. How is it possible for the EU to celebrate Israel in the light of this brazen illegality, now over decades, over half a century? How is that possible? Yet the EU cannot accept that the people of Crimea can return to Russia, and the current state of affairs being described as a Russian occupation of Crimea. And secondly, equally impossible to answer, how is it possible for the United States of America to demand recognition of the illegal, unilateral secession of Kosovo from Serbia whilst denying the same right to the people of Crimea? How can that logically, as a matter of simple logic, how can that be squared? How is it possible? You can invent a state called Kosovo, torn from its own country, Serbia, where a substantial Serbian minority are now persecuted, religiously, nationally, ethnically persecuted, under the guns of NATO. And yet, you're ready to risk World War III over Kupiansk? I keep telling you to fasten your seatbelts. This is going to be a bumpy night because it is the mother of all talk shows.